Welcome to Dying in Grace, the program dedicated to educating all of us about issues of death and dying, living well, and how we can ultimately all die in grace. My name is Arlene Stepputat, and each week I like to invite a friend from our community that has a unique perspective, experience, or knowledge to share with all of you watching our show. And this week, I am delighted to introduce you to my friend David Selberg, who is the CEO of Hospice of Santa Barbara.
Hello, Arlene, and thank you for having me.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming here. And we have a lot to share about Hospice of Santa Barbara. But before we do that, tell me how you got involved in working in end of life.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was about 1988, 89, and I was a volunteer for the local AIDS program. It was called AIDS CAP back then, later to become Pacific Pride Foundation. And I was a volunteer buddy working with folks that were dying of AIDS. Mm-hmm. There was no treatment way back when.
Right.
And I went through the volunteer training, and I met the leader of Hospice of Santa Barbara at the time, Gail Rink, and she taught us as volunteers back in 1989 about death, dying, as we were experiencing that with our AIDS patients. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I, since we're contemporaries, and I've done other shows about living through the AIDS crisis, and for me it was in New York City and working with teenagers and babies. And for people that are not quite old enough to remember that, it was quite a unique time, and it really was a call to arms for people of compassion against a lot of fear and a lot of prejudice.
Exactly.
And
stigma.
And
yeah.
And just that was a time when a diagnosis equaled death and a horrible death.
Exactly. If you were when you were diagnosed with HIV, when the AIDS diagnosis came with any number of opportunistic infections, you were given about an 18-month time period of life from your AIDS diagnosis. So in our community, you were back east, living in a big city, serving so many. In our communities here in Santa Barbara, we were serving literally hundreds of mostly men, mostly gay men, that were dying of AIDS very quickly. And we, as volunteers, and I later went to work for the organization, which is now Pacific Pride, we were there to support those people going through HIV/AIDS. It was a different time.
It was a different time. How did it shape you? I mean, how did it inform you and the other decisions you made?
It really changed my life in a significant way, because I had lost friends to the epidemic and to the disease, and it shaped me in a way that it's so hard sometimes to put into word. It made me a bit more contemplative, quieter, supportive. I was raised in a very faith-based family, and that season, that time of the AIDS crisis, before any treatments were there, really brought me to a place of service. It really got me into the kind of work that would become my career over the last 30 years. So. Yeah, it shaped me definitely, Arlene.
Yeah.
And you,
yes.
I'm sure.
Yes,
yeah.
Definitely. And I always say this to people who work in our field in death and dying, that it calls you. I mean, hospice or death and dying as a field, it calls, it's a calling. It's almost not a choice. I mean, at some level, yes, you stepped up and said, I'm going to volunteer. But once it gets you.
Yeah. It is a calling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we felt like a small, powerful group of volunteers and staff at the AIDS program that it was definitely a calling, and it changed so many of our lives going through that journey. So many of these people that were struggling and dying from the disease were isolated. Their families had rejected them,
right,
as you remember, and they were alone. And so we were there not just for we were there for emotional support as much as medical and practical support.
And I think the other thing, at least for me, is I also learned how to carry and work with and through grief. as you, because that is the other piece of it. There's ongoing grief. This person that you cared and loved is dying, but this person now needs me. And so there's something that gets developed that is a kind of resiliency. It's not a shutting down, because you can't do the work if you shut down, but there's something.
That's so true, isn't it? I can recall that so clearly. I remember we would sign up for funerals, those of us on staff at Pacific Pride way back in those early 1990s.
Right.
And I remember the funerals were weekly, and just like you said, we'd have to kind of take a deep breath and go on to the next person going through the illness, and it was way before treatments, as you recall.
Right. Yeah. So from that, I know you then became the executive director of Pacific Pride, continued to work with AIDS in the Central Coast, and did phenomenal work for many, many years.
Yeah.
And then how did you get to Hospice of Santa Barbara as the executive director?
Well, that's quite an interesting journey. So many wonderful people that I knew that I know in this community. I encouraged them to apply to the position of CEO of Hospice of Santa Barbara. And one day a dear friend of mine said, David, you've been 20 plus years doing LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS work, and why don't you consider putting your hat in the ring? And it was just days before the cutoff, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do that. And I went through the whole process, and this wonderful group of people that were on the board of hospice and community members invited me to take the position, and I did. And I absolutely feel so blessed to be able to be in this leadership role at Hospice of Santa Barbara.
Well, I think as a community member and someone that's worked alongside you, it's a blessing for all of us, and I'm really glad you said yes and spread your leadership and your loving to a broader arena.
Thank you.
So let's talk about Hospice of Santa Barbara, and one of the things that people get so confused in this community about Hospice of Santa Barbara and the other hospices that are in town. And so Hospice of Santa Barbara is a voluntary hospice. It's not a medical hospice. Can you explain to people essentially what that means?
Yeah, it's really a state-regulated term, volunteer hospice organization. And it means that we're not the medical side of hospice. We're the social, emotional support of hospice work in the community, along with Visiting Nurses Hospice Care, another amazing organization. So we really, through our bereavement services, our grief services, as well as our patient care services, we help those going through terminal or life-threatening illness, as well as helping those grieving the loss of a loved one. So we're more of a social model hospice, and we work very much in partnership with, as I said, Visiting Nurses Hospice Care, and there's a whole variety of other hospice services in town, unrelated to our two organizations.
Right. So one thing that's part of the confusion, but one of the things that I'm quite proud about, is that Hospice of Santa Barbara is the second oldest hospice in the country.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
It
so
really is.
Can you tell a little bit, do you know the story of how all that happened a little bit?
I do a bit. This amazing woman, and just jump in as I share this, Cicely Saunders developed this out of England.
Right.
And it's established itself on the East Coast. And this amazing woman locally, her name was Alice Heath, and she opened up Heath House, which became an AIDS house during the tough years of AIDS in our community. She was our founder at Hospice of Santa Barbara, and she had Cicely Saunders with others on her radar and helped bring some of these amazing, innovative women to Santa Barbara to begin to train us locally on what hospice is. It's very different now than it was way back in the early 1970s. As Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was writing her books about it, Cicely Saunders was very high profile internationally. And it was very much back in that era, as you know, it was about people going through the dying process in their homes, being nurtured and loved and cared for by those that they love, their family and their friends. That was the original hospice. And it wasn't until the 1990s, when Medicare, Medi-Cal, insurance reimbursements, private insurance reimbursements started attaching dollars, insurance reimbursement dollars, to hospice, that it became more medicalized.
Right.
And
it became part of the Medicare benefit.
That's exactly right.
Right. Well, the one thing I do know is that at least part of what I know is Cicely Saunders came out to Yale to teach some nurses. She was invited to, and I think Alice went to that seminar.
Was that the event she went to?
And so New Haven, where Yale is, has the first one.
That's right.
And then Alice came out here, and it was not an easy sell, as you can imagine. I mean, it's hard enough today, when it's well established, to get people to buy into hospice and healthcare, as you know. But in those days, the doctors, I mean, she really had to be a pioneer. And what Cicely Saunders also helped do with the history of hospice is go beyond the physical condition of a dying patient and do the holistic. So she made the space for what Hospice of Santa Barbara so well addresses, the psycho-spiritual, emotional pain that comes out of that.
Our dear friend, yours and mine, who died several years ago, Gail Rink, used to say, death is not a medical event. Death is not, she would always say that. It's not that. It's a personal, it's a human event. It's a human process, not
it's
a
a
medical
process too.
Yeah.
It's not an event. It is a process.
That's true, actually.
It is not, it is not just this moment of,
That's right. It is a process. You're absolutely right.
And so that, I think one of the beauties of what Hospice of Santa Barbara does, it allows for people to enter wherever they or their loved ones are in the process.
That's right.
So one thing that I think is important to understand is if I wanted to access your services of Hospice of Santa Barbara, how much do I have to pay?
It is all free. All of our services, both our grief and bereavement support.
So I don't need insurance coverage,
No.
I don't need all that? Okay.
None of that.
I know in a medical hospice, before I can qualify to get services, I have to have a doctor's diagnosis, I have to have a prognosis of 6 months, that's the medical piece,
That's
I have
right.
to have all that. What's the requirements to get services with you?
Thank you. It's anyone going through terminal or life-threatening illness, and it can be beyond that 6-month window of the medical definition of hospice. So it can be someone, for example, with Alzheimer's with a longer timeline. It can be someone, it can be a woman going through metastatic breast cancer that has a positive prognosis but will be going through brutal treatment and with the expectation of recovery. So I
don't have to die to get on your services?
You do not. And it's the same with our grief and bereavement services. It can be anticipatory grief if someone you love is going through an illness and you need support, therapy support, or it can be after the death. And it's family support, it's individual support, it's teens, children, adults, seniors.
Yeah, I want to just give a shout out to the unique focus that you have on teens, and part of the reason is because, full disclosure, well, I've said this on the show before, I got involved with Hospice of Santa Barbara as a volunteer because of the I Have a Friend program, and I heard Gail Rink, at that time as the executive director, talking about the need that children who lost parents had, and how she started this program because the kids kept saying, like, am I going to be okay?
Yeah.
And I resonated with that because, of course, when I was 11, my father died. I didn't have anyone, and it took me forever. And I just heard that on the radio, and I said, I want to be a part of that. I could have so used that. I could have so used that. And so you have a unique focus on helping children and grandchildren. So can you talk a little bit about the unique children? Besides the I Have a Friend program, which uses mentors, you have some unique things you do for children.
We really do. We do art therapy, sand tray therapy. We have our counselors in every junior high and high school in South Santa Barbara County. And
so they're actually on site?
They're on site every week. Some of the schools were there twice a week. So for example, at Santa Barbara High School or San Marcos or Santa Barbara Junior High, our counselors are there doing both one-on-one counseling as well as group counseling for these teens and kids that are experiencing in their homes either grief from loss and death in their families, or actively going through that situation with the dying process of a loved one. So that's one of the premier things we do. We also do a lot of art therapy. We do a PAL program where, let's say, either the mom or dad have died, and the children and the surviving parent need support. We have support groups. So the whole family will come in, we'll serve them dinner, we'll break up the grown-ups, the parents, from the kids as far as...
So you'll have several families who have lost
That's right.
a primary parent. So
Yeah.
you look around and you go, oh, we're not the only ones.
That's right. And these kids support each other. They make deep friendships. The parents don't feel so isolated as widowed or what have you. So that's one of our other very innovative programs, serving kids in the community.
Well, I know too that you have your bereavement group. And one thing I want to say to our viewers is that, because there's often a misconception that to use any hospice, whether it's visiting nurse or to use the bereavement services, the loved one had to die on the service. And that's not true. That anybody that's had a death, if your loved one got hit by a car 3 weeks ago, you don't have to be involved that way. And I think that's an important thing, because people think, well, they didn't die on their, they weren't involved. Doesn't matter.
That's right.
That's a very important thing, because I think people forget that it's a resource. But you also have done some groups for what I would say are sometimes the forgotten people, like survivors of suicide.
That's right.
Which is something that people don't often talk about.
Absolutely.
So do you know, how did that come about, that you saw some of these holes? Where did that come from? Because that's been for a while, I think.
We've always had, that's almost been a support group, and it changes, it's time limited, but we've always had survivors of suicide support groups. Sometimes at any one time, we'll have 2 of those groups going. It can be a very, as you just said, an isolating experience for the survivors of that. And we have a whole variety of other support groups, widowers support groups, adult children grieving the loss of a parent, or parents grieving the loss of an adult child. So we have a whole variety of support groups.
Well, I'm going to mention 2 others, one of which I was extremely grateful for myself. Well, one is you have a group for people who have had a stillborn child or a miscarriage.
Yes.
And again, that is a group that doesn't get acknowledged. People try to, oh, you'll have another kid, or, we just don't know how to do anything with that.
That's right.
That, I think, is so important to fill a gap. But the other thing that I personally took advantage of was of the pet grief. And as an animal lover, where my animals are my family as well as my humans,
Indeed.
Having a space with other people who have lost their animals that they loved, and to talk about it, because I think I don't think society, we're very good at grief at all.
Exactly.
And we tend to really negate pet grief.
Exactly, we do. I just had, I've had an animal in my home, a cat, and she died quite old. And oh my gosh, I went through such sadness. The house was so quiet without Zelda walking around and just being Zelda. And so you're right, so many of us in the community, when a pet dies, it's part of our family, and you're so right.
But Hospice of Santa Barbara is a place that offers an opportunity.
That's right.
To do that.
That's right.
And you've also done some unique ways to bring people to your agency, which is, by the way, quite beautiful. And we should tell everybody it's located behind the Riviera Theater.
That's right.
Up on the hill, so it's a beautiful place.
That's right. 2050 Alameda Padre Serra, APS Road, right behind the Riviera Theater.
Right.
It's a very beautiful place.
But you, so things are free because of the generosity of our community.
That's right. We're 100% donor enabled. Donations and donors have enabled us to provide all our services completely free. Just truly amazing.
And yet you do some fun things to bring people in. So tell us a little bit about your art exhibits that you have in the Lee Block room.
Yes, quarterly we bring in a different artist that's somehow touched by death, dying, or the work we do, and they display their art and they invite their friends. We put it out on our newsletter, and every quarter, every 3-4 months, we have a new artist. And it's a way to bring people up to our offices and not make it feel so heavy or down or morose, so to speak. Our offices are beautiful, they're healing, there's children running around.
There's always dogs on the front lawn.
There's always dogs on the front lawn. Yeah, it's really a very wonderful healing place.
And I think that's really an important invitation, because I do think that just the idea of walking through the doors of Hospice of Santa Barbara, you know, people feel like there's neon and everyone and their brother's going to know that you're there. And so to have other opportunities to come there, and you've done some educational things there, and I don't know if you're still doing Learn at Lunch, but that's been periodic. So,
we do.
So talk about Learn at Lunch, because our viewers might be interested.
We bring in local folks that might be expert in certain areas of any area related to end of life, death, or dying. And it's a Friday, usually the last Friday of the month, but just go to our website to learn what Friday it is. And we talk about all sorts of things, from senior needs and issues around end of life or health. My predecessor, Steve Jacobson, did a Learn at Lunch that talked about how other cultures across the world manage or interact with death and dying, and the history of those cultures and how they held the sacredness of death and dying. So every month we have a different speaker, and people just bring their lunch, and it's an hour, and it's really quite a little gift to the community.
It really is, and it's you know, for anybody that might be interested, you can come 5 minutes or 10 minutes late. You can leave early. You know, there's nobody that's like watching a clock. It's just free to come in, and it's a great opportunity. There's so few places in our community where people can really talk about death and dying. We've had the Death Cafe on, and that's another avenue, but we need to start having these conversations, exploring all these different topics.
That's right.
In places that are safe without feeling stigmatized.
That's right.
And I think that Hospice of Santa Barbara does a great job of creating an environment for that.
Yeah, it really does.
I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about the impact of the Montecito mudslides, and also you were talking about your teams, and I know that your teams also go out en masse when certain tragedies happen in the community, and it could be in the school. Mm-hmm. But what kinds of response did you offer our community during the recent, mudslides? Well, almost recent.
Our counselors, our therapists, who are all licensed therapists, they went with police escort actually behind police barricades, and there were certain sites in the lower village of Montecito, upper village, where we provided immediate trauma counseling and grief support to those going through the disaster as it was unfolding. Our counselors were also at some of the emergency sites mm-hmm. that were at various churches, at the city college in town, providing emotional support. So much of that disaster was related to grief and loss and trauma, and a good number of our counselors, our therapists, are trauma trained, EMDR trained, which is a modality that came out of the Vietnam War, helping veterans, as you know, mm-hmm. With trauma and PTSD. And so when a disaster like this happens, such as the Thomas mudslides, it is such emotional trauma to a community. So we offered support groups, as did other organizations, and Cottage Hospital.
Yes. I think, the thing that's true about dealing with death and grief is a community, whether it was in the AIDS crisis. I mean, that's right. What we saw. And we're blessed in our community. People do rally, but we're also blessed that we have the kind of resources that Hospice of Santa Barbara
Yeah.
offers, and those resources are the hearts of the people that are willing to go in the tough places.
Yeah.
You know, you have an extraordinary staff of people.
They are. It's a fabulous group of people.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the volunteer component that you have at Hospice of Santa Barbara. So besides the mentors that work with the children, you have volunteers that are trained. What kinds of things do they do for your clients?
We've got over 100 volunteers. They're all trained in end of life. And a lot of these volunteers support our patient care services, helping people going through terminal life-threatening illness with both practical and emotional support. So it can be accompanying somebody to a doctor's appointment, or it can be going to the beach with them and sitting. Also, we have a special volunteer program that we do in conjunction with Visiting Nurses Hospice Care called NODA, which means No One Dies Alone. And there are so many seniors in our community that are in facilities, in convalescent care facilities, that might not have anyone sitting with them during the final hours, the last 72 hours of life. So these special volunteers, both from Hospice of Santa Barbara and Visiting Nurses Hospice Care, come and sit vigil with these individuals in these facilities the last 72 hours, holding their hand, being with them. Because oftentimes the staff in these programs can't devote that level of attention to someone who's going through the dying process. They try, but they can't. So,
Well, I'm also aware too, full disclosure, I am a NODA volunteer, so I know that. Thanks for bringing that
absolutely.
up. Is that a lot of times these people, yes, there's some that have no family, and often they have no family close by.
That's right.
And we've also gone in and sat with people until the son can drive up from Orange County and get there.
That's
so
right.
there's relief for the family to know someone's there.
That's
you know?
right. Yeah, you're
And
so right.
It's such a sacred opportunity. Well, David, thank you so much for sharing, and I'm so excited to have you here. In this book, we ask you to write the name of someone who is still in your heart but is no longer on the planet. It's our Book of Living Love. I would like to thank TVSB for allowing us to film this show. I'd like to thank Mike Nicholson and Elliot Jacobson, my crew, and if you're interested in watching other Dying in Grace shows, you can go to YouTube Dying in Grace. We're so grateful that you're with us. Thanks so much again, David,
Thank
for
you,
being
Arlene.
here.